The rain fell in heavy sheets, a relentless cascade that blurred the city lights and muffled the sounds of honking cars and hurried footsteps. Lucas Andrade, a man accustomed to moving through life like a storm himself, barely noticed the weather. His thoughts were elsewhere: business negotiations, financial forecasts, and the deal of a lifetime that awaited his final signature in the morning. Money was his language, and the intricacies of finance were his battlefield. Yet tonight, something strange pierced his perfectly orchestrated world. It started with a silhouette. Amid the bustling street, a figure sat motionless on a bench beneath a flickering street lamp. As Lucas's car came to a halt at a red light, his gaze lingered on the woman drenched in rain. Her head bowed low, arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Something about her stillness contrasted painfully with the chaos surrounding her. "Drive on," Lucas instructed his driver, but the words felt hollow. As the car eased forward, he glanced back and saw her lift her face. Her eyes caught his, even through the blur of rain on the car window, a mixture of despair and defiance. Lucas had seen many emotions in the faces of his business rivals, but this was different. He couldn't explain why, but he told the driver to stop. Stepping out into the rain, Lucas approached her cautiously. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. The woman flinched, as if his words were shards of glass cutting through her isolation. She hesitated before answering, her voice barely audible. "I'm fine." Her soaked clothes and trembling hands betrayed the lie. "You don't look fine," he replied, kneeling slightly to meet her eyes. "Let me help you. There's a hotel nearby. You can dry off, get warm." "I don't need charity," she snapped, her tone sharp, but her expression betraying exhaustion. Lucas saw something familiar in her, pride clashing with vulnerability. He recognized it because he lived it daily, hiding cracks in his own armor while navigating the merciless world of high-stakes finance. He didn't press her further, but said firmly, "This isn't charity, it's a choice. You can accept my offer or stay here and prove a point to nobody." Her hesitation lasted a moment too long. Finally, she stood, shivering but resolute. "All right." In the warmth of the hotel lobby, Lucas watched as she accepted a towel from a staff member and dried her face. Stripped of the rain and the street lamp's shadows, she looked younger than he had first thought, though her weary eyes told a different story. "Thank you," she muttered, avoiding his gaze as they sat down in a quiet corner of the lounge. "But I'll pay you back." Lucas allowed himself a rare smile. "That's not necessary." "It is," she insisted. "I don't take handouts." Her defiance was sharper now, though it lacked the venom of their first exchange. "What's your name?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "Clara," she replied hesitantly. "Clara Mendez." "Well, Clara Mendez, why don't you start by telling me why you were sitting alone in the rain?" Lucas wasn't sure why. He felt compelled to ask. His life was carefully curated to avoid entanglements outside of his controlled world of numbers and transactions. But something about Clara had stirred a part of him he didn't even know still existed. Her expression darkened. "I've had a rough time lately." She paused, as if weighing whether to continue. "My husband left me, took everything we had. Money, savings, even the business we started together, left me with nothing but debt and shame." Lucas remained silent, sensing there was more. "I thought I knew him," she continued, her voice faltering. "But I guess money changes people. Or maybe I never really knew him at all." The irony wasn't lost on Lucas. He had built an empire by understanding the power money wielded over people. Yet here sat someone who had been crushed by that same force. "Debt isn't shameful," Lucas said finally, his voice steady. "It's a circumstance, and circumstances can change." Clara scoffed, spoken like someone who's never been on this side of the table. Lucas leaned forward, his tone soft but firm. You'd be surprised. The conversation hung in the air like the aftermath of a thunderstorm, charged, unresolved. Lucas felt a strange mix of emotions he couldn't quite place. Compassion, curiosity, whatever it was, it compelled him to offer more than just a dry towel and a hotel room. "Stay here tonight," he said. "Tomorrow I'll help you figure out what's next." Clara studied him warily. "Why would you do that? What's in it for you?" Lucas shrugged. "Maybe I've spent too much time in the world of finance. It's refreshing to meet someone who reminds me there's more to life." She didn't respond, but for the first time, Lucas saw a flicker of something besides pain in her eyes. Hope, perhaps, or suspicion, maybe both. As she reluctantly agreed, Lucas felt a shift within himself. He wasn't sure why he had stopped his car that night, but something told him this encounter was only the beginning of a story far more complicated than he could imagine. What do you think of Clara's story so far? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the hotel lounge, warming the polished wooden floors and casting long shadows across the room. Clara sat at a table near the window, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. She stared out at the city bustling to life, but her mind was far away, tangled in thoughts she couldn't escape. The events of the previous night felt surreal, as if she had stepped into someone else's life for a moment. Lucas approached, his presence steady, but non-imposing. He placed a small notebook on the table in front of her and took the seat opposite her. "I had the concierge prepare a list of job leads and resources for you," he said. His tone was matter-of-fact, almost businesslike, but there was an undercurrent of concern she couldn't ignore. Clara glanced at the notebook, but didn't reach for it. "I appreciate it," she said cautiously, "but I don't need a stranger managing my life." Lucas leaned back, folding his arms. "I'm not managing your life. I'm offering you a way forward." She shook her head, her voice tight. "You don't understand. People like you never do. You have money, options. You've never had everything ripped away overnight." Lucas's expression didn't waver, but his eyes darkened slightly. "You're wrong about that," he said quietly. The weight of his words lingered between them. Clara looked up, her curiosity piqued despite herself. She waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. Instead, he gestured toward the notebook again. "You don't have to use it, but it's there if you want it." Clara hesitated, then picked up the notebook. She flipped through the pages, scanning the neatly written notes. There were listings for temporary housing, organizations that assisted with financial recovery, and even potential employers willing to take on someone without formal experience. Lucas had thought of everything, it seemed. For a moment, she felt a flicker of gratitude, but it was quickly overshadowed by her lingering mistrust. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice edged with suspicion. Lucas met her gaze evenly. "Because I can, and because I think you need it." Clara's grip on the notebook tightened. She wanted to argue, to push him away, but the truth was, she didn't have the luxury to refuse. Her pride was all she had left, and even that was starting to feel like a luxury she couldn't afford. "Fine," she said finally, "but I don't need you hovering over me. I'll figure this out on my own." Lucas nodded. "Fair enough." He stood, giving her space, but as he turned to leave, she called after him. "Why were you out last night?" He paused, looking back at her. "Couldn't sleep," he said simply. "Sometimes work keeps me up." Clara frowned. The answer felt deliberately vague, but she didn't press him. She watched as he walked away, his stride confident and purposeful, and wondered what kind of man would go out of his way to help a stranger. It didn't add up. Later that day, Clara ventured into the city with the notebook in her bag. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Maybe a sense of direction, maybe proof that Lucas's intentions were genuine. The city had always been a maze to her, its towering buildings and endless streets, a stark reminder of how small she felt in the grand scheme of things. As she walked, fragments of her past replayed in her mind. Her ex-husband, Daniel, had been the center of her world for years. She had trusted him completely, never questioning the financial decisions he made or the life they built together. It wasn't until the day she came home to find their bank accounts drained and their home emptied that she realized the extent of his betrayal. Now, every step felt like a battle. The jobs she'd applied for since losing everything had all turned her away. Without credentials or experience, she was just another name in a sea of applications. Lucas's help felt like a lifeline, but also a weight she wasn't sure she could bear. As evening fell, Clara found herself outside a modest diner. The sign on the door read, "Help wanted, no experience necessary." She hesitated, staring at the sign, her thoughts racing. Taking this step felt like admitting defeat, but walking away meant clinging to a pride that had brought her nothing but pain. Before she could decide, her phone buzzed. She pulled it from her bag and saw an unfamiliar number. Against her better judgment, she answered, "Clara Mendez." The voice on the other end was smooth, but carried a hint of menace. "It's been a while." Her heart sank. She recognized the voice instantly. Daniel. "I don't know how you got this number," she said coldly, her grip tightening on the phone, "but I have nothing to say to you." "Oh, I think you do," Daniel replied. "We have some unfinished business, and if you're smart, you'll meet me." Clara's pulse quickened. Every instinct told her to hang up, to cut him off for good. But there was something in his tone, a veiled threat, or maybe a promise of answers she didn't want but needed to hear. "Where?" she asked reluctantly. Daniel gave her an address, then hung up without another word. Clara stood frozen on the sidewalk, the phone still pressed to her ear. She felt a swirl of emotions, fear, anger, and an unshakable sense of foreboding. Her gaze drifted to the diner door, and the sign that had caught her attention. One decision could change everything, but she wasn't sure which path would lead her to safety or destruction. The city lights flickered on around her, and she realized just how dark the streets had become. The air was colder than Clara expected as she approached the address Daniel had given her. A narrow alley opened into a dimly lit parking lot behind a rundown warehouse. It was the kind of place where shadows lingered too long, and the silence felt weighted, as if holding its breath. Clara tightened her coat around her shoulders, every step forward testing her resolve. The sound of her heels on the pavement echoed in the emptiness. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. Instead, she found herself face to face with Daniel, his figure illuminated by the faint glow of a flickering streetlight. His suit was sharp, his posture confident, but his presence carried a venom she remembered all too well. "You came," he said with a smirk, as if her presence was inevitable. "Get to the point," Clara snapped. "What do you want?" Daniel chuckled, the sound low and mocking. "Still feisty. I always liked that about you." He leaned against the hood of his car, pulling out a cigarette and lighting it with deliberate slowness. "Relax, Clara. I'm not here to hurt you." "Could have fooled me," she replied, crossing her arms to mask the tremble in her hands. Daniel exhaled a stream of smoke, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "You look different, a little more desperate than the last time I saw you." Clara felt a surge of anger, her fists clenching at her sides. "You don't get to talk to me like that, not after what you did." He held up a hand, feigning innocence. "What I did? Oh, Clara, you make it sound so dramatic. Business is business. You knew that when you married me." "Don't you dare call it business," she spat. "You left me with nothing, no money, no home, and no explanation. You didn't even have the decency to warn me." Daniel's expression hardened, the mask of charm slipping for a moment. "You're right. I didn't warn you because you wouldn't have understood. You never did." "Understood what?" Clara demanded. "That you're a liar, a thief?" He stepped closer, the heat of his presence both suffocating and chilling. "Understood that the world doesn't care about fairness. It's about power, control, and I did what I had to do to survive." Clara took a step back, her breath hitching. She hated how his words still had the power to make her question herself, to dredge up the insecurities she thought she'd buried, but she wouldn't let him see that. "What do you want, Daniel?" she asked again, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. He smiled, the predator once more. "Information," he said simply. "You've been spending time with Lucas Andrade, haven't you?" Clara blinked, her confusion giving way to suspicion. "How do you know that?" Daniel's smile widened. "Let's just say I have friends in high places, or maybe low ones, depending on your perspective." "Why do you care?" she asked, though her gut already twisted with unease. Lucas had been nothing but kind to her, too kind perhaps, and now Daniel was circling, like a shark scenting blood in the water. "Lucas and I have history," Daniel said cryptically. "Let's leave it at that. But I need you to do something for me. Get close to him, find out what he's planning." Clara stared at him, disbelief and anger coursing through her veins. "You're out of your mind if you think I'd help you." "Think carefully," Daniel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I know things about Lucas that you don't. Things that could ruin him, and you, by association." "Why would I believe anything you say?" she shot back. "Because I've always been honest about one thing," he said, his gaze piercing. "I don't lose." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Clara wanted to scream, to lash out, but she held herself together by a thread. She turned on her heel and walked away, her footsteps quick and deliberate. She didn't look back, even as she felt his eyes on her, a predator watching its prey. The night swallowed her whole as she made her way back to the hotel. Her thoughts were a tangled mess, memories of Daniel, the unspoken truths about Lucas, and her own precarious position caught between them. She didn't know who to trust, or if trust was even an option anymore. When she finally reached her room, the exhaustion hit her like a wave. She sank onto the bed, staring at the ceiling as her mind raced. Lucas's help had seemed like a lifeline, but now it felt like a noose tightening around her neck. And Daniel, he was a storm she thought she'd escaped, only to find herself dragged back into his chaos. Sleep wouldn't come, so Clara did what she always did when her thoughts refused to quiet. She grabbed the notebook Lucas had given her and began flipping through it. Each page was meticulously detailed, filled with opportunities she hadn't considered and paths she hadn't dared to explore. For a moment she felt a flicker of hope, but then her mind returned to Daniel's words. His cryptic warning about Lucas gnawed at her. What if he was right? What if Lucas wasn't the savior she wanted to believe he was? Clara closed the notebook and stared out the window. The city lights shimmered like distant stars, offering no answers, only questions. And in the pit of her stomach, she felt the weight of a decision she wasn't ready to make. The following morning, Clara awoke with a heaviness in her chest that the sunlight streaming through the window couldn't lift. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind, each word from Daniel cutting deeper as she tried to piece together his motives. The idea of being used again, this time as a pawn in a game she didn't understand, filled her with a simmering anger she couldn't shake. Pushing herself out of bed, she tried to focus on the small steps forward Lucas had laid out for her. The notebook sat on the desk, its pages a quiet reminder of the opportunities she had yet to explore. She opened it, scanning the list of job leads and resources. The practicality of it grounded her, but the memory of Daniel's insinuations lingered. Could Lucas really be hiding something? And if so, what? By mid-morning, Clara found herself standing outside a cafe recommended in Lucas's notes. It was a bustling corner spot, known for its lively atmosphere and reputation for hiring workers without much experience. She hesitated before stepping inside, her nerves threatening to undo her resolve. The manager, a cheerful woman named Maria, greeted her warmly and listened intently as Clara explained her situation. "We're always looking for people who are willing to work hard," Maria said, her smile reassuring. "Why don't you start tomorrow?" Clara thanked her, relief washing over her. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was a start. As she left the cafe, her thoughts drifted back to Lucas. She hadn't told him about the encounter with Daniel. Something in her resisted the idea, as if revealing that part of her past would somehow give it more power. But she couldn't ignore the growing tension between her gratitude for Lucas's help and her suspicion about his true intentions. That evening, Clara found herself at Lucas's office. The building was sleek and imposing, a testament to the wealth and influence he wielded with such ease. She had agreed to meet him there to discuss next steps, though she wasn't sure why she felt compelled to go. Perhaps it was curiosity, or the need to confront the questions gnawing at her. Lucas greeted her in the expansive conference room, his demeanor as composed as ever. "How did it go today?" he asked, motioning for her to sit. "I got a job," she said simply, watching his reaction. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Good. That's a solid step forward." As they talked, Clara couldn't help but notice how effortlessly he shifted between offering advice and asking questions that made her think deeper about her choices. There was an ease to him, a confidence that felt almost disarming. And yet, Daniel's voice echoed in her mind, reminding her that Lucas wasn't as simple as he appeared. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked suddenly, interrupting him mid-sentence. Lucas paused, his expression unreadable. "I told you, I've been in a place where I needed help. Someone gave me a chance, and I'm paying it forward." "But why me?" Clara pressed. "There are plenty of people out there who could use your help. Why stop your car that night?" Lucas leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "You reminded me of someone I used to know," he said after a moment. "Someone who didn't get the help they needed." The weight of his words caught Clara off guard. There was a sadness in his voice, a vulnerability she hadn't expected. But before she could ask more, Lucas shifted the conversation back to practical matters, as if closing a door she wasn't meant to open. As the night deepened, Clara left his office with more questions than answers. She wandered through the city streets, the noise and energy around her a sharp contrast to the turmoil inside her. Lucas had given her the tools to rebuild her life, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his generosity than he let on. And then there was Daniel. His demand that she spy on Lucas had felt absurd at first, but now it gnawed at her like an itch she couldn't scratch. What did Daniel know about Lucas, and why did it feel like she was caught in the middle of something far bigger than herself? Clara's steps slowed as she reached a small park, its quiet paths lit by soft lamplight. She sank onto a bench, her thoughts churning. She felt like a pawn in a game she didn't understand, torn between two men who each held pieces of her future. But she wasn't willing to be anyone's pawn, not again. As she sat there, a plan began to form in her mind. If Daniel wanted information about Lucas, she would find out what he was hiding, but not for Daniel. She needed answers for herself to understand why her life had become entangled with these two men and their secrets. Only then could she decide who to trust, or if she could trust anyone at all. The plan started as a whisper in the back of Clara's mind, a fragile idea fueled by equal parts curiosity and desperation. She needed to untangle the web around her, Daniel's threats, Lucas's enigmatic generosity, and her own precarious place between them. Yet the deeper she thought about it, the more she realized that she wasn't just seeking answers about them. She was searching for herself, for the person she had lost in the wreckage of her old life. Her first step was small, observing Lucas more closely. He was meticulous, almost to a fault, and rarely let his guard down. The next time they met, Clara noticed how his phone buzzed with constant notifications, how his replies were swift but never hurried. His confidence radiated through every word, yet there was a shadow beneath his polished exterior, a hint of something unresolved. She had seen it in his eyes when he spoke about the person she reminded him of, but Lucas had quickly buried that moment, leaving her wondering what lay beneath his calculated calm. A few days later, Clara decided to act. She arrived at Lucas's office under the guise of discussing her progress. He greeted her warmly, but his focus was divided, his attention darting between her and the papers spread across his desk. She watched him closely, every movement calculated, as she considered how to broach the subject that had been weighing on her. "Lucas," she began, her tone deliberately casual, "you mentioned someone I reminded you of. Was it someone you lost?" He paused mid-motion, his pen hovering above the page he was signing. His expression flickered, an imperceptible shift, but one Clara didn't miss. "Yes," he said finally, setting the pen down. "Someone very important to me." She waited, hoping he would elaborate, but the silence stretched between them. "What happened?" she asked, careful not to press too hard. Lucas leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "She disappeared years ago. One day she was here, and the next, gone. No explanation, no trace." His voice was steady, but Clara could hear the ache beneath it. It's the kind of thing that leaves a mark. You move on, but it never really goes away. Clara felt a pang of empathy she hadn't expected. She had lost everything in a different way, but loss was loss. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He nodded, his focus shifting back to the papers on his desk. The conversation was over, at least for now, but Clara's curiosity only grew. Lucas's response had been honest, but it felt incomplete, like there was more he wasn't saying. And she couldn't ignore the way her name had seemed to catch in his throat when he first met her, as if it had meant something more to him than just another name. Later that evening, Clara found herself pacing her small apartment. Her thoughts were a whirlpool, pulling her deeper into questions she couldn't answer. Why had Lucas been so willing to help her? Was it truly because of someone from his past, or was there something more? And what did Daniel know that made him so certain Lucas had secrets worth uncovering? Unable to sit still, Clara opened her laptop and began to search. Lucas Andrade's name brought up a flood of articles, most of them praising his business acumen and philanthropic efforts. He was celebrated as a self-made billionaire, a man who had risen from humble beginnings to dominate the world of finance. Yet the more she read, the more she noticed the gaps. There were years of his life that seemed to vanish from the narrative, periods where no interviews or articles mentioned his whereabouts or activities. Then she found something, a brief mention in an old financial blog about a scandal involving a missing woman connected to Lucas's company. The article was vague, more speculation than fact, but it hinted at embezzlement and accusations that had been quietly settled out of court. The woman's name wasn't mentioned, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this was connected to the person Lucas had spoken of. Her pulse quickened. Was this what Daniel had been hinting at? And if so, why hadn't Lucas told her? The questions churned in her mind as she stared at the screen, the glow of the monitor casting sharp shadows across her face. The next day, Clara returned to Lucas's office under the pretense of needing more advice. She watched him carefully, noting the subtle ways he deflected personal questions, the way he redirected the conversation whenever it veered too close to his past. She felt like she was walking a tightrope, each step bringing her closer to answers, but also closer to danger. As they spoke, Lucas's phone buzzed again, and he glanced at the screen with a flicker of irritation. "I have to take this," he said, standing and stepping out of the room. Clara's heart raced. This was her chance. She glanced around the office, her eyes landing on the stack of folders he had been working on. She hesitated, guilt and curiosity warring within her. But the need for answers won out. She reached for the top folder and flipped it open, scanning the documents inside. Her breath caught. Among the financial reports and business contracts was a name she hadn't expected to see. Daniel. The realization hit her like a blow. Lucas and Daniel weren't just connected, they were entangled in ways she couldn't yet understand, and whatever game they were playing, she was caught in the middle. The sound of footsteps brought her back to reality, and she quickly closed the folder, her pulse pounding as Lucas re-entered the room. He gave her a brief smile, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he let on. As she left the office, the weight of what she had discovered settled heavily on her. The line between ally and adversary had blurred, and she no longer knew who to trust. But one thing was clear: the truth was more dangerous than she had imagined. And she was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The night had never felt darker to Clara. She sat by her apartment window, the faint hum of the city below failing to soothe her thoughts. Daniel and Lucas, two men who, despite their vast differences, were somehow connected in ways she didn't fully understand. Her discovery in Lucas's office had left her shaken, the name Daniel etched into her mind like a scar. Why was Lucas dealing with him? And more importantly, why hadn't he said anything about it? She turned the questions over in her head, each one leading to more uncertainty. Trust felt like a fragile illusion, something she couldn't afford to give lightly. Yet, in her heart, she couldn't believe Lucas was the same as Daniel. There was a sincerity in his actions that Daniel had never shown her, a quiet empathy that hinted at something real. But then again, had she not once believed the same about Daniel? Sleep eluded her, and by the time morning came, she had resolved to confront Lucas. She needed answers, not just to ease her own doubts, but to understand why her life had become tangled in the complex web of these two men. Lucas greeted her with his usual calm when she arrived at his office. His demeanor was effortless, unshaken, but Clara noticed the way his eyes lingered on her, as if sensing the weight she carried. "I need to ask you something," she said, skipping the pleasantries. Lucas set down the file he was holding and gestured for her to sit. "Go ahead." Clara hesitated, her words catching in her throat. She knew the risk of accusing him outright, but she couldn't let her fear silence her. "I saw something yesterday, in your files, Daniel's name." Lucas didn't flinch, but the atmosphere in the room shifted subtly. The air felt heavier, charged with unspoken tension. "I see," he said after a moment, his voice measured. "And what exactly do you think that means?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Clara said, her tone firm. "Daniel told me to spy on you, said you were hiding something. I didn't believe him, but now—" She trailed off, her uncertainty hanging between them like a fragile thread. Lucas exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "Clara, Daniel and I have a history. It's not something I'm proud of, but it's part of the reason I was able to help you." "What kind of history?" she pressed, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want to pull you into it," he said, his gaze steady. "Daniel and I crossed paths in business years ago. Let's just say his methods weren't exactly ethical, and I had to make some difficult choices to protect my company." Clara narrowed her eyes. "And now? Why is his name in your files?" Lucas hesitated, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in him. "Because he's not done. He's been trying to manipulate his way back into my world, using every angle he can find. I didn't tell you, because I didn't want you to worry, or worse, to feel like you were caught in the middle. But I am in the middle, Clara said, her voice rising. You brought me into this, Lucas, whether you meant to or not. Lucas leaned forward, his tone softening. I never wanted that for you. My only goal was to help you get back on your feet. Clara's chest tightened, the sincerity in his voice pulling at something deep inside her. She wanted to believe him, to trust that his intentions were as pure as he claimed. But the shadow of doubt loomed large, fueled by the scars Daniel had left behind. What happens now? She asked, her voice quieter. Lucas met her gaze, his expression resolute. Now, we deal with Daniel. Together. The word together hung in the air, a fragile promise that offered both hope and danger. Clara didn't know if she could fully trust Lucas, but she knew she couldn't face Daniel alone. For better or worse, their fates were tied. That evening, as Clara walked home, her mind raced with the implications of Lucas's words. She replayed their conversation, dissecting every detail, every nuance. His calm assurance had been comforting, but it hadn't erased her doubts. Could she really trust him to stand by her, or was he just another player in a game she didn't understand? As she reached her apartment building, she noticed a figure waiting near the entrance. Her pulse quickened, but when the figure stepped into the light, her stomach dropped. It was Daniel. "Hello, Clara," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with false charm. "We need to talk." Clara's body tensed, her instincts screaming for her to run, but she stood her ground. "I don't have anything to say to you." "Oh, I think you do," Daniel said, his smile sharp as a knife. "I hear you've been spending a lot of time with Lucas. How's that going?" Clara glared at him. "If you have something to say, just say it." Daniel's smile widened, and he stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "Lucas isn't who you think he is," he said, his voice low. "He's just as dangerous as you think I am. Maybe even more." Clara's breath hitched, her mind racing. She wanted to dismiss his words, to write them off as another manipulation, but the certainty in his tone was unnerving. And for a moment, just a moment, she wondered if he might be telling the truth. Daniel leaned in, his voice a whisper. "Be careful, Clara. You don't know the half of it." With that, he turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Clara standing alone, her thoughts a storm of confusion and fear. She clenched her fists, the weight of his words sinking in. Whatever the truth was, she knew one thing for certain. She had to find it before it was too late. The air inside Clara's apartment felt stifling as she paced the small living room, Daniel's words replaying in her mind like a sinister mantra. "Lucas isn't who you think he is." Every syllable dripped with malice, designed to worm its way into her doubts and fracture the fragile trust she had built with Lucas. And the worst part, it was working. She tried to distract herself by cleaning, organizing, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from spiraling. But as the hours dragged on, the tension only grew. Lucas had given her the tools to rebuild her life, yet Daniel's insinuations made her question whether those tools came with strings attached. What if she was nothing more than a pawn in some larger scheme? Her phone buzzed, shattering the heavy silence. She glanced at the screen. Lucas. Her finger hovered over the answer button before she finally picked up. "Clara." Lucas's voice was steady, calm. "I wanted to check in. Are you okay?" Her grip tightened on the phone. "Define okay," she said, unable to hide the edge in her tone. There was a pause. "What happened?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Clara hesitated, debating whether to tell him about Daniel's late-night visit. But something held her back, a nagging fear that voicing it would make it more real, or worse, that Lucas's reaction might confirm her worst fears. "Nothing," she lied. "I'm just tired." Lucas didn't press her, but she could feel his unease through the phone. "If there's anything you need..." "I know," she interrupted. "Thanks." After hanging up, Clara sank onto the couch, her mind racing. Lucas's concern seemed genuine, but so had Daniel's charm once upon a time. Trusting anyone felt like a gamble she couldn't afford to take. The next day, Clara decided to take matters into her own hands. If she was going to untangle the truth, she couldn't rely on Lucas or Daniel to hand it to her. She needed to dig deeper. Her first stop was the city library. The old building was quiet, the faint hum of fluorescent lights the only sound as she sat in front of a public computer. She searched for everything she could about Lucas Andrade, his business ventures, his philanthropic work, and most importantly, the scandal she had stumbled upon days earlier. The deeper she dug, the more questions surfaced. The missing woman connected to Lucas's company had been a prominent employee, a financial analyst rumored to have uncovered irregularities in the firm's accounts. The case had made headlines briefly before vanishing from the public eye, overshadowed by Lucas's meteoric rise in the world of finance. But one detail stood out: the analyst's name, Sofia Mendez. Clara's blood ran cold. Mendez, her own last name. It was a common enough surname, but the coincidence was unsettling. Could there be a connection? And if so, what did it mean? Her thoughts were interrupted by the librarian's voice announcing the library's closing. Clara packed up quickly, her mind swirling with possibilities. As she stepped into the cool night air, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text, an address with no name attached. Her stomach knotted. She didn't recognize the location, but the timing felt deliberate, as if someone was watching her every move. Against her better judgment, she hailed a cab and gave the driver the address. If this was a trap, she needed to spring it herself. The cab dropped her off in front of an upscale townhouse in a quiet neighborhood. The lights inside were dim, but one window glowed faintly. Clara's pulse quickened as she climbed the steps and knocked on the door. It opened almost immediately, revealing Daniel. His expression was smug, as if he had been expecting her all along. "Clara," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "I'm glad you came." "I'm not staying long," she said, her voice cold. "What do you want?" Daniel gestured toward the living room, where a table was set with papers and photographs. "I thought you might want to see the truth for yourself." She approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the table. The photographs were grainy, but recognizable. Lucas meeting with various men in suits, exchanging what looked like documents or briefcases. One image showed him shaking hands with someone Clara recognized as one of Daniel's former associates. "What am I looking at?" she demanded. "Proof," Daniel said, leaning casually against the wall. "Lucas isn't the knight in shining armor he pretends to be. These meetings, they're with people who'd sell their own families for the right price. And Lucas, he's buying." Clara's head spun. The images were damning, but they didn't tell the whole story. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Because you need to know what you're dealing with," Daniel said, his tone almost gentle. "Lucas doesn't do anything out of the kindness of his heart. He has a plan, and trust me, you're part of it." Clara clenched her fists, her anger rising. "You expect me to trust you? After everything you've done?" "I don't expect anything," Daniel said, his expression hardening. "But you deserve to know the truth. Whatever you do with it is up to you." She stared at the photographs, her mind a whirlwind of doubt and confusion. The Lucas she had come to know didn't fit this narrative, but Daniel's evidence was hard to ignore. The lines between truth and deception blurred, leaving her grasping for clarity. Without another word, Clara turned and walked out, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. She didn't look back, even as she felt Daniel's gaze burning into her. As the night wrapped around her like a suffocating shroud, Clara knew one thing for certain. She couldn't run from the truth anymore. Whatever Lucas was hiding, she had to uncover it. And if Daniel's warnings were even partially true, the fallout could destroy everything. The morning sun filtered weakly through Clara's apartment window, but it did little to dispel the storm brewing inside her. She sat on the edge of her bed. The photographs Daniel had shown her burned into her memory. The images of Lucas, calm, composed, and deeply intertwined with a world of questionable dealings, were impossible to reconcile with the man she thought she knew. Clara's fingers traced the edge of her phone as she debated her next move. Confronting Lucas seemed inevitable, but she couldn't go in blind. If Daniel's accusations held any truth, then Lucas's silence wasn't just about protecting her, it was about protecting himself. And if Lucas had lied, what else might he be hiding? Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a text from Lucas. "Meet me at the park, 3 p.m. I have something important to discuss." Clara stared at the screen, her heart pounding. The timing couldn't have been worse, or perhaps it was exactly what she needed. If Lucas had something to say, she would listen. But this time, she would be ready. The hours crept by, each one tightening the knot in her stomach. When the time finally came, Clara wrapped herself in a coat and headed to the park. The winter chill bit at her skin as she walked through the winding paths, her breath visible in the crisp air. She spotted Lucas standing near a fountain, his tall figure silhouetted against the fading light. "Clara," he said as she approached, his tone warm but guarded. "Thanks for coming." She nodded, crossing her arms against the cold. "What's this about?" Lucas hesitated, his eyes scanning her face as if searching for something unspoken. "I've been meaning to tell you more about my past," he began, his voice steady, but tinged with something she couldn't quite place. "There are things you deserve to know." Clara raised an eyebrow, her suspicion sharpening. "Such as?" He gestured to a nearby bench, but Clara remained standing. Lucas sighed and looked away for a moment before speaking again. "There was someone I cared about deeply. Sofia Mendes. She worked for my company. She was brilliant, driven, but she discovered things she wasn't supposed to." Clara's pulse quickened. "Like what?" "Financial irregularities," Lucas admitted, his tone grim. "A senior partner had been embezzling funds, and Sofia found the trail. She came to me with the evidence, and we agreed to expose him. But before we could, she disappeared." The weight of his words hit Clara like a tidal wave. Sofia Mendes, her name, her disappearance, everything suddenly felt too close. "And you never found out what happened to her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I tried. I hired investigators, pushed every connection I had, but it was like she vanished into thin air. The partner she exposed settled quietly, and I made sure he was removed from the company, but I've never stopped looking for her." Clara's mind raced, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Sofia's name, her connection to Lucas, and the eerie coincidence of their shared surname. It was too much to ignore. "Do you think Daniel had anything to do with it?" she asked, the question tumbling out before she could stop herself. Lucas's expression darkened. "I wouldn't put it past him. He's capable of far worse than most people realize." Clara swallowed hard, her thoughts tangling in a web of fear and uncertainty. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" "I didn't want to drag you into it," Lucas said, his voice softening. "You've already been through enough." Clara stared at him, her emotions warring within her. On one hand, his confession felt genuine, a glimpse into the pain he carried. But on the other, it left her with more questions than answers. Why had Sophia's disappearance been buried so quietly? And why did Daniel seem so intent on painting Lucas as the villain? "I need time to process this," she said finally, stepping back. Lucas nodded, his gaze heavy with understanding. "Take all the time you need. Just know that I'm here if you have questions or if you need anything." As Clara walked away, her thoughts churned with doubt and suspicion. The story Lucas had told her felt incomplete, like a puzzle missing its final piece. And Daniel's warning lingered in her mind, a dark shadow she couldn't ignore. That night, Clara sat at her desk, staring at her laptop screen. The name, Sofia Mendez, blinked back at her from a search engine, each result pulling her deeper into the mystery. One article in particular caught her eye, a piece from years ago speculating that Sofia had been silenced to protect someone high up in Lucas's company. The implications were chilling. If Lucas had truly been trying to help Sofia, why hadn't he said more? And if Daniel had played a role in her disappearance, what did he stand to gain? Clara leaned back in her chair, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. She was closer than ever to understanding what had happened, but every step forward felt like a step deeper into the unknown. For the first time, she wondered if she could trust either man, or if they were both just different sides of the same coin. The city outside her window buzzed with life, but inside, Clara felt the suffocating silence of isolation. The answers were within reach, but with them came the risk of shattering everything she thought she knew. And yet, she couldn't stop. The truth was out there, and she was determined to find it, no matter what it cost her. The night air was heavy with anticipation as Clara stepped out of her apartment, her footsteps echoing against the empty streets. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but none of them fit neatly. Sofia Mendez, Lucas's evasive truths, and Daniel's cryptic warnings, it all felt like a house of cards waiting for the faintest gust to bring it down. Yet Clara couldn't walk away. Not now, when the truth was so close. In her bag, she carried the photographs Daniel had given her, as well as notes she had compiled from hours of research. Her destination was Lucas's office, where she hoped to find the final thread that would tie everything together. It was late, and she knew the building would be nearly deserted, a fact that both comforted and unsettled her. When Clara arrived, the front desk security guard barely glanced at her. She had been in and out of Lucas's office enough times to avoid suspicion. Taking the elevator to the top floor, she rehearsed what she might say if Lucas caught her. But deep down, she wasn't looking for a confrontation. She was looking for clarity. The office was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the city lights filtering through the large windows. Clara moved quickly, her hands trembling as she sifted through the neatly organized files on Lucas's desk. Most of it was routine: contracts, financial reports, meeting notes. But then she found something that stopped her cold, a folder labeled Mendez Confidential. Her heart raced as she opened it, scanning the documents inside. What she found wasn't just unsettling, it was devastating. There were transcripts of conversations, emails between Lucas and his legal team, and detailed records of Sofia's findings. The evidence was damning: embezzlement, fraud, and names that Clara recognized as powerful figures in Lucas's inner circle. But what shocked her most was a handwritten note clipped to the final page. "Mendez is becoming a liability. This needs to be resolved immediately." Clara's breath caught. The note wasn't signed, but its implications were clear. Sofia had been silenced, not for her mistakes, but for uncovering the truth. And Lucas, whether directly or indirectly, had been complicit. Before Clara could process the weight of her discovery, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Panic surged through her as she quickly returned the folder to its place and ducked behind a nearby bookshelf. The door creaked open, and Lucas stepped inside, his silhouette framed by the city lights. He moved toward his desk, his movements deliberate but tense, as if he too were carrying the weight of the world. Clara held her breath, praying he wouldn't notice anything out of place. But as he sat down and began sorting through the files, his expression shifted. He froze, his hand lingering on the Mendez Confidential folder. "Clara," he said softly, his voice cutting through the silence. "I know you're here." Her heart sank. She stepped out from her hiding place, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension between them palpable. "I can explain," she began, her voice shaking. Lucas held up a hand, his expression unreadable. "You don't need to. I know what you've seen." Clara swallowed hard. "Then you know why I had to look, why I couldn't just take your word for it." Lucas nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the folder in his hands. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But I didn't know about this note until it was too late. By the time I realized what had happened, Sophia was already gone." "And you didn't say anything?" Clara demanded, her anger rising. "You just let it happen?" "I tried to fix it," Lucas said, his tone pleading. "I've spent years trying to make amends, trying to ensure nothing like this ever happens again. But some things can't be undone." Clara shook her head, her emotions a storm of betrayal and disbelief. "You built your empire on lies," she said, her voice breaking, "and Sophia paid the price for it." Lucas stood, his presence towering yet vulnerable. "I won't deny that I've done things I'm not proud of, but you have to believe me when I say I never wanted this. I never wanted her to disappear." Clara's fists clenched at her sides, her mind racing. "And what about Daniel? He seems to think you're still playing the same games." Lucas's expression darkened at the mention of Daniel's name. "Daniel's been trying to bring me down for years. He's using you to get to me, just like he's used everyone else." "And what if he's right?" Clara shot back. "What if you're not as innocent as you claim?" Lucas's silence was damning. He didn't argue, didn't try to convince her otherwise. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice low and filled with urgency. "If you don't believe anything else, believe this. Daniel is dangerous. He doesn't care about you, Clara. He's using you as a pawn in his vendetta against me." Clara took a step back, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She didn't know who to trust. Lucas, with his half-truths and buried secrets, or Daniel with his calculated manipulations. The line between ally and enemy had blurred beyond recognition. "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't do this right now." Lucas nodded, his eyes filled with something Clara couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe, or resignation. "Take all the time you need, but be careful, Clara. The truth has a way of consuming everything in its path." As Clara left the office, the city lights seemed dimmer, the weight of the truth pressing down on her shoulders. She was closer than ever to understanding what had happened to Sophia, but every step forward felt like walking deeper into a minefield. And she couldn't shake the feeling that the final explosion was just around the corner. The night was silent, the kind of stillness that carried an eerie weight. Clara stood outside an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, her breath visible in the cold air. The address had been sent to her phone hours earlier, an anonymous message she could only assume came from Daniel. He had promised answers, and Clara was desperate enough to take the bait. Her footsteps echoed on the cracked pavement as she approached the rusted door. Pushing it open, she stepped inside, her senses on high alert. The space was cavernous, dimly lit by a few flickering bulbs that cast long, ominous shadows. In the center of the room, Daniel waited, leaning casually against a metal table. "Clara," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "Right on time." "What do you want?" she demanded, her tone sharper than she felt. She wasn't here to play games. Daniel smirked, gesturing to the table. "I thought you might like to see something. Consider it the missing piece of your puzzle." Clara's eyes fell on the pile of documents spread across the table. She approached cautiously, scanning the pages. There were bank statements, legal memos, and emails, each one painting a damning picture of Lucas's involvement in Sophia's disappearance. But as she dug deeper, another layer of the story began to emerge. "You're lying," Clara said, looking up at Daniel. "These documents, they don't prove anything." "Oh, they prove enough," Daniel replied, his smirk widening. "Lucas orchestrated the cover-up. He knew exactly what was happening, and he let it happen. Everything he told you was a lie." Clara's hands trembled as she flipped through the papers. The evidence was compelling, but something didn't sit right. The timing, the connections, none of it felt as clean as Daniel made it out to be. "Why do you care so much about bringing Lucas down?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. "This isn't about Sophia, is it?" Daniel's smile faltered just for a moment. "Lucas destroyed my life," he said, his tone venomous. "He took everything from me, my business, my reputation. This is about justice." "Or revenge," Clara shot back. Before Daniel could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Clara turned, her heart racing as Lucas appeared from the shadows. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with intensity. "Daniel," Lucas said, his voice low and steady. "I should have known you couldn't stay out of this." "Ah, Lucas," Daniel replied mockingly, "just in time to witness your empire crumble." Lucas ignored him, his attention focused on Clara. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softening. Clara nodded, but her mind was spinning. "Lucas, what is this? Is any of it true?" Lucas stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "Some of it," he admitted, "but not the way Daniel wants you to believe. He's twisting the truth to suit his narrative." Daniel laughed, the sound harsh and hollow. "Of course you'd say that. You've spent your whole life manipulating people." "Look who's talking," Lucas shot back, his tone cold. "You've been feeding Clara lies to turn her against me, using her to settle your own score." Clara's frustration boiled over. "Enough!" she shouted. "Both of you have been lying to me. I deserve the truth, all of it." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut. Finally, Lucas spoke. "Sophia was a whistleblower. She discovered fraud in my company, but the people responsible weren't just employees. They were connected to Daniel. When she tried to expose them, they made her disappear." Clara's chest tightened. "And you covered it up." "I did what I had to do to protect her legacy," Lucas said, his voice steady. "I couldn't bring her back, but I made sure the people who hurt her were dealt with. Daniel included." Daniel's laugh was bitter. "You mean you destroyed my business and framed me for crimes I didn't commit? You were complicit," Lucas snapped. "Don't pretend you're innocent." Clara felt the weight of their words pressing down on her. Both men had blood on their hands, but the line between justice and revenge was impossibly blurred. "So where does that leave me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why am I even here?" "Because you deserve to know the truth," Lucas said, his expression softening. "And because Sophia, she was your sister." Clara's breath caught, her knees threatening to give way. "What?" Lucas nodded, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I didn't know until recently. When I met you, something about you felt familiar. When I looked into your background, I realized the connection." Tears welled in Clara's eyes as the truth sank in. Sophia's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy, it was personal. And now, she was left to pick up the pieces of a story that had shattered her world. Daniel scoffed, breaking the silence. "Touching, really, but none of this changes the fact that Lucas used you, just like he used Sophia." "Enough," Clara said, her voice firm. She turned to Daniel, her eyes blazing. "You're no better. You've been playing me from the start, twisting the truth to suit your vendetta. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but Clara didn't give him the chance. She turned to Lucas, her voice steadier now. And you kept this from me. Even if your intentions were good, you still lied. Lucas nodded, accepting her words without protest. I understand. Clara stepped back, her mind racing. The truth was messier than she'd ever imagined, but one thing was clear. She couldn't trust either of them completely. I need to think, she said, her voice quiet but resolute. As she walked out of the warehouse, the cold night air hit her like a wave, but it couldn't numb the storm inside her. The story wasn't over, not for Sophia, not for Lucas, and not for herself. What do you think? Share your thoughts below. Your perspective matters.